6 months later, Monica was accompanied by the secretary to process her papers for resuming her studies at her university. On the way there, she suddenly felt a sharp pain from her belly, which was not subsiding. On tenterhooks from the past few months, Monica unexpectedly went into premature labor. They would not reach Lewis's family's private hospital on time, so the secretary hastily drove her to a gynecology hospital in town and calmly went through the necessary procedures. Monica lay on the bed, her face pale as death. When she looked up, a fluorescent lamp's light flashed in front of her eyes. She broke out in a cold sweat while in excruciating pain. She was finally going to be released after 8 months of pregnancy. The secretary accompanied her to the delivery room, encouraging her at all times. "Don't be afraid, Miss Thames. You and the kids will be fine. I'll be outside waiting for the good news." "Thank you." Monica closed her eyes as she was pushed into the delivery room, the doors shutting behind them. The director of the hospital was acquainted with Matthew. Upon learning that the one who was about to give birth was Monica, the doctor immediately contacted him. Matthew rushed to the hospital after receiving the message and waited impatiently outside the delivery room. 4 hours later, a resonant wail could be heard from the room. "It's a healthy baby boy!" The nurse placed the baby into an incubator and sent him to the nursery room for newborns. Matthew did not care about the baby. He paced about and frantically looked around outside the delivery room. The secretary walked toward the nursery room. Inspecting the newborn from the other side of the glass window, she turned to ask, "What about the other one?" The nurse apologetically replied, "We're terribly sorry. Because it is a premature delivery, the younger one is too weak. When he came out, he was already not breathing." The secretary's face stiffened from shock and inquired, "Is there no hope?" The nurse frankly said, "No." She was disappointed, but she could do nothing about it. "Fine. Please deal with that child accordingly." When she was done talking to the nurse, she held up her phone to contact some of her people to send an ambulance over. She intended to transfer the newborn to the Lewis family's private hospital. Before she left, she filled out a check and passed it over to Mr. Thames. She spoke politely. "Mr. Thames, your daughter has suffered a lot for these past few months. This is the remaining payment. Please accept it." Dazed, Mr. Thames received the check from her. The secretary then left in a hurry. Inside the delivery room, Monica was exhausted of her energy, and she passed out. The nurse went over to her and was about to deal with the stillborn infant. However, just as she held him up, she noticed something strange. Her pupils shook and her expression changed drastically. She frantically rushed toward the doctor with the baby. "Doctor!" 6 years later, time passed. Years and months went by in a flash. Within the bustling crowd in a departmental store, Monica, who was pushing a cart, anxiously looked around back and forth. Her steps were hasty. She just went to the daily essentials section to take something. However, when she looked backward, he was gone and was nowhere to be found. Passing by the toys section, she slowed down her pace and scanned the entire area. Suddenly, she caught sight of a petite figure. Monica shrugged before sighing helplessly. The corners of her mouth curled up, and she chuckled to herself. She then pushed the cart toward that direction and bent down behind the figure. A little boy was standing in front of a rack, his eyes focusing on a beautifully wrapped remote-controlled racing car. He seemed really young, about 5 or 6 years of age. He was wearing a set of clean school uniform that was a little big for his thin frame. Smooth, silky jet black hair, jade-like skin, a youthful face with exquisite features, and rosy cheeks, he was quite a lovely boy. He owned a pair of large, glistening eyes, which twinkled at times, clear and beautiful. His deep-set eyes were framed by thick, curly lashes that were slightly upturned like 2 feathers of a black phoenix. His black orbs were clear and free of any impurities. This charming young boy looked just like a fairy tale. However, right now, the little fairy had a serious look on his face, seemingly possessing the maturity of an adult. $150? Too expensive! The young man's voice had a solemn tone that was out of character for his age. The way he furrowed his brows as he began counting with his fingers reminded him of a matured man. He then sighed in agony, his shoulders dropping, as if he was in a world of darkness. Monica helplessly chuckled at his dejected demeanor, yet her heart was slightly bitter. She pursed her lips and reached out her hand to tap his shoulder. The little boy, shocked, twisted around. Realizing that it was her, his face turned a strange shade of red. "Mommy! Mommy looked for you for so long! Didn't Mommy ask you to follow her obediently and not to run around?" Monica pretended to be mad, and the little boy clearly felt some guilt. His small hand carefully latched onto her neck. With his lashes slightly drooping, he incessantly blinked his wide eyes as he mumbled, "Mommy, don't be angry. Andres will not run around anymore." "My dear Andy." She kneeled down and hugged him. "What are you looking at?" Andy instinctively pointed at the racing car, but as though he had thought of something, he quickly retraced his little fingers. He then lifted his face and feigned disinterest. "Mommy, Andy is just looking and doesn't really want it." He might have said this, but his eyes never left that beautifully packed remote-controlled racing car. They have completely given him away. Her expression went cold. He was still very young, yet he had learned to speak against his wishes. She knew that he really wanted it, but he was trying to help her save up. This child was an absolute sweetheart from birth. She laughed and patted his little head. She stood up and went to the counter, indicating the racing car to the cashier. Andy locked his sight on the toy before looking at Monica again. As though having guessed what was about to happen, his eyes lit up and radiated with excitement. He ran toward the counter and longingly stared at the beautifully packed toy that was now in the hands of the cashier, not looking away even once. The cashier placed the racing car on the counter to scan its barcode. The little boy placed his hand on the counter and eagerly hovered over the edge of it on his tiptoe, his small face showing a contented expression. Monica followed behind him. Looking at his bright smile, she was visibly moved. If she could not even grant the small wish of her child, then she did not deserve to be called a good mother. All these years, she had owed too much to this child. She gave birth to twins for that man 6 years ago. They were both quite weak when they were born because they were premature babies. Andy's situation was even more dire. Andy's brother had taken up too much of the nutrition while they were still in her womb, and as a result, Andy was not breathing when he was born. Her father had told her that as soon as the older one was out. He was taken to the newborn nursery ward and then transferred to another hospital. Simultaneously, the nurse who had delivered the babies made an unexpected discovery. Andy, who was declared dead when he was born, was slightly breathing.
Did you like this story? You can listen to thousands of such stories on the Pocket FM app. You can download the app now. Click on this icon on your screen or click the drop-down icon right beside the video title. Or search for Pocket FM on the App Store on your iPhone. Now tap the Get button on your iPhone to install the app. Join millions of other listeners on the Pocket FM app and discover thousands of riveting stories today.